All right, I am going to run us through how to do a waste yarn tubular cast on. All right, so what you need for this process is waste yarn in a highly contrasting color to the yarn that you'll be using for your project. Okay, so you can see that these are very highly contrasting yarns, and that's what we will want to start with. Because we're going to be cutting out this waste yarn, and you do not want to have confusion between the waste yarn color and the color of your sweater. Okay, so what I've done here is I cast on with my waste yarn on my ribbing needle half the number of stitches that the pattern calls for. Okay, it works a little bit easier if you have a odd number of stitches. So if, for instance, the pattern tells you to cast on 100 stitches for your ribbing, you'll want to cast on 50. But like I said, I go to the higher odd number, so I would actually cast on 51 stitches with my waste yarn. Okay. So once you've got that, you want to go to your main color yarn and attach it. So I like to do that by shaking the camera a lot, by inserting my needle into that first stitch, making a loop with my main color yarn, and then just attaching that to that first stitch. Okay, so that first stitch is always going to be a knit stitch, so I am just going to knit that first stitch with my main color yarn and then tuck that tail in with the rest of my tails there. All right, so the first row of this tubular cast on is knit the first stitch, then you'll want to yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one. That's the whole row. All right, so you will just be putting a yarn over between every stitch that you cast on, and this will get you up to pretty close to what your cast on number should be here. All right, we're not going to be too concerned with stitch counts as we're working through this process, so just keep going and we'll worry about stitch count later. Okay, so once you work your way to that last stitch, you want to make sure that you put a yarn over and then knit the last stitch. Okay, so that's our first row of our waste yarn tubular cast on. Our second row is going to be the same as the third and fourth row. All right, but the first row here looks a little bit different because we are seeing the purl bumps from our waste yarn. It's going to make it a little bit easier. Okay, so remember what I said, you want to always knit the first and last stitch of every row throughout this process. So I'm just going to knit that first stitch. Now I want to work in pattern here. Okay, so I want to knit the knit stitches so I can see that first stitch is one of my yarn overs from the previous row. That's a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit it. The second stitch I can tell is a purl stitch because I can see the purl bump in my contrasting color there, so that makes that a little bit easier. Purl stitches, you want to take the yarn to the front, slip that stitch purlwise, and then take the yarn to the back. All right, so knit the knits, yarn goes to the front, slip the purl stitch, yarn goes to the back. Knit the knits, slip the purls with the yarn in the front. This is row 2 of this process. Okay, knit the knits, slip those purl stitches purlwise with the yarn in the front. And as you can see, you can kind of get in a rhythm with it, but if you get off, it's pretty easy to see those purl bumps, especially when you're working with the contrasting color. Okay, so I've got 2 stitches left. That's a knit stitch in pattern, and then remember what I said, you always want to knit the first and last stitch. So here's the last stitch I'm going to knit, tighten up my tails here, and that is row 2 of our tubular cast on here. So row 3 is the same, But we have to really keep an eye on where our pearl bumps are because they're less easy to see because everything's in our main color yarn now, okay? So remember, we're knitting that first stitch. Don't worry about what it looks like. You're just knitting it. And now you want to read your knitting and make sure that see that stitch for me is a pearl. So I'm going to take my yarn to the front, slip that stitch purlwise, take my yarn to the back. Knit one, slip that pearl stitch purlwise with the yarn in the front. Knit one, slip it. Knit one, slip it. Okay? So now I'm on row 3 of this 4-row process, and it's really easy to forget what row you're on. My trick for that is if you are working away from your tails here, that is going to be an odd row. If you're working toward them, that is going to be an even row. All right, so since I'm working away from my tails, I know that I am on row 3 of this process because I'm certainly not on row 1. Process of elimination. All right, I'm down to 2 stitches here. The second from last stitch is in pattern, so that's a purl stitch. I'm going to slip that purlwise with the yarn in the front. Last stitch I'm not going to worry about because I know that I'm just going to knit it. You always knit the first and last stitch. Turn this around again, and now I am going to do my last row of my tubular cast on, knit the first stitch, and now we're working in pattern. I can see that that first stitch is a knit, so I'm going to knit it, slip the next stitch with the yarn in the front, knit the knits, slip the next stitch with the yarn in the front. All right, so that's our pattern again. I'm just going to work to the end of this row, and then the tubular cast on is done, which is great because that means that you're going to have a really nice stretchy neckline. Again, last stitch, going to knit that stitch. All right, and that is our tubular cast on. Easy peasy. All right, so leave this waste yarn in. I generally leave my waste yarn in until the very end of my sweater. You can cut that out though at any point. Just give yourself a couple inches away from it, and it stabilizes that neckline. Those neckline stitches. So don't cut them out right away. Leave those in there. You will now be joining to work in the round if you are doing a neckline. So give your stitches a count. You'll see that the first and last stitches are the same, not the same. All right, so they're not going to be in pattern if you join. So give your stitches a count. Hopefully you have one extra stitch so you can just knit or purl those 2 stitches together once you join to work in the round and then be at your stitch count. But if you're not, that's not a big deal. You can always add a stitch to get yourself to your stitch count, just in pattern after that join too. You will have a little bit of a jog because you've worked 4 rows here at your join, but that's not a big deal either because you can, when you're done with your sweater, just use your tail to, you know, seam those stitches together pretty easily. Okay, that is the waste yarn tubular cast on. I hope this was super helpful and good luck.